Our first speaker is a colleague of ours, Dr. Peter Fitzsimons. Peter studied botany at UCL Dundee and Nottingham Trent University and gained his PhD. What did you get your PhD in? Biology?
Stomatal physiology.
Stomatal, that's why I can't remember. He's worked in the timber protection industry and for various large companies and came to us in 2018. Peter's looked after the invasive weed section of the association as its technical representative since then. And I'd like him to welcome him to the stage so he can talk to us about glyphosate. The session is entitled Looking to the Future. I think sometimes we have to look behind us to understand what's coming too. So Peter, if you'd like to take the stage. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Everybody hear me okay at the back? Very good. For those of you that were wondering, it is jolly warm in here. So apologies for that, but hopefully everybody's taken their layers off and you're all comfortable now. Thank you very much, Steve. Let's crack straight on. I've got a bit of a surprise slide for you to start off with because it's nothing about glyphosate. It's just a little bit of a news flash for you, a bit left field. But just to let you know that as of yesterday, so this is fresh off the page as it were, we were notified by RICS that the guidance note on Japanese knotweed in residential property is no longer a guidance note, it's a professional standard. So you see in the top left-hand corner there, it's now called a professional standard. They've just rationalised their library, their technical library, their guidance documents to their members. The hyperlink, the URL to find the document has not changed. So you don't need to dive into all of your documents and your programs and everything to change the links that you provide to your clients to find the document, but you do need to now refer to it as the RICS Professional Standard, Japanese knotweed and residential property. So I thought it was quite important that you know so that you're ahead of the game, as it were, and not end up being told this by your clients, but we'll send out an email to confirm early next week. So onto the main course, the future of glyphosate and why we need to consider alternatives. Glyphosate, to some extent, all of the debate and discussion about this particular herbicide, it could be referred to as the elephant in the room sometimes. You know, we need it, we use it, it's an extremely useful tool in our armoury. But there's a lot of negative publicity about it in the news all the time, pretty much all the time. And so we're kind of firefighting a little bit in terms of the reputation. But what I want to talk about today is not to stand up here and make a justification for glyphosate or to tell you that it's wonderful or otherwise. We're not toxicological experts. We don't pretend to make those decisions. But what I do want to discuss with you is the ever-present risk. It was present 5 years ago before the European agency extended the approvals for another 5 years. And it might be present again in the very near future where the use of glyphosate might be restricted to some degree or other. So we need to think now about planning for the future and about thinking about, well, what do we do if we can't use glyphosate in certain situations? But first of all, before I do, excuse me, getting a bit of reverb. This is glyphosate up here, top right-hand corner. So I expect you're all familiar with it, that you know the molecular formula. So all the black ones are carbons, that's a nice easy one. All the white ones are the hydrogen atoms, that's another nice easy one. And then of course we've got red, so oxygen. So it's a classic carbohydrate type of molecule, nothing unusual about it at all. Does anybody know what the blue one is? Come on, volunteers. Nitrogen, and the orange one? Phosphorus. So it's quite an interesting molecule in the thing. There's a lot of different things going on there, lots of different atoms, but it's actually a very simple molecule for a herbicide, disarmingly simple. And this is one of the reasons why it gets translocated around plants so easily, because plants tend to look at this molecule and think, there's nothing wrong with this molecule, we'll take it up, we'll shove it in the phloem, we'll move it around, we'll get it down into the root system, and that helps us enormously. But then, of course, as soon as that enzyme gets into the plant, it blocks synthetic pathways for amino acid synthesis, prevents growth, and causes its effects. If anybody doesn't recognise this plant in the bottom right-hand corner, leave the room now. You shouldn't be here. So what are the essential features of glyphosate? I mean, obviously it's formulated into various products, so-called Roundup brands and various others. But it's been around for a long time. We've got 50 years of commercial experience, principally in agriculture, obviously, but a lot of amenity applications as well. It's a non-selective weed control chemical, which basically is a useful attribute in the context of this particular slide. And it's often used to control, a variety of weeds, broadleaves and monocots in agriculture together. It's a systemic, so it's taken up and moved around the plant, so it's not just a contact herbicide. It can get into the guts of the plant, as it were, and cause a systemic killback effect. So it's very useful for perennials with long-lasting root systems like Japanese knotweed. Today, well, certainly, I don't know, somebody else can probably tell me this, I don't know when this came about, but the people at Monsanto, now Bayer, changed all their surfactant and formulation systems for the Roundup brand, and so consequently they've been able to produce what's called clean label formulations for a long time now. So in terms of its overall safety profile, there are a lot of these products, Provantage, Bioactive, are essentially non-hazardous from a labelling point of view. I hope you appreciate that doesn't mean it's non-hazardous from a risk assessment point of view, but certainly from a labelling point of view it's non-hazardous. And the useful attributes of glyphosate include the fact that from a regulatory point of view it's practically the only herbicide approved for use on hard surfaces for weed control and or near watercourses. So almost a completely unique profile of attributes. And obviously we use it a lot by stem injection from time to time where appropriate. So that's another useful way of delivering it into the plant rather than foliar application. And we now have eco plugs available for woody plant control. There aren't yet, I don't think, approvals for use on Japanese knotweed crowns or anything like that, but there have been some experiments done on that as well. But what about the counter-arguments? Obviously, I've said straight away there are lots of questions being asked about glyphosate, and we need to be aware of those and address them. First of all, the widespread use of glyphosate, particularly in agriculture, has led to some weed resistance. There's probably only about half a dozen or so weeds, most of them in North America, where resistance is starting to be a problem. But it's very, very unlikely to arise with Japanese knotweed, of course, because it tends to spread by vegetative means rather than through pollination and seed generation. So it's a non-selective herbicide, so it's a positive and a negative. I mean, the fact that it's non-selective means that obviously there's always a risk of some adverse effects on plants which are not intended to be treated. And the safety question is always present with glyphosate. And there's two main reasons for this. I don't want to oversimplify the argument. Well, one is largely around the advent of GMO crops which are glyphosate resistant. And this led to some kind of correlation between the use of glyphosate and some kind of dark arts within the world of plant breeding. And consequently, there was a lot of sort of negative associations around glyphosate because of that. And then, of course, more recently with the recent work that was done about 7 or 8 years ago at a UN-funded laboratory in France, which indicated there might be some carcinogenetic properties. So there are conflicting messages all the time in the media about whether glyphosate is the best thing since sliced bread or indeed the worst. And then, of course, we have to recognise that from time to time, there are mispractice takes place. We're trying to push forward standards of professionalism and so on. But any herbicide is capable of getting poor press because of inappropriate use. We have to think about residues. There's an awful amount of work going on amongst the Environment Agency. Increased levels of resource going into measuring residues in soils and watercourses. and obviously glyphosate is just on the list of all the herbicides that are being looked at there. But lastly but not least, we need to think very carefully about the sustainable use regulations. And this really applies to all herbicides, so this isn't really about glyphosate, it's just one of the messages I want to get across today, and I know I've been doing this when I've been doing audits with member companies recently, is that we need to be very, very clear about our duties and responsibilities under the sustainable use regulations to consider alternatives to herbicides. Even if you know right from the get-go, even if you know from the first conversation with your client that they are not interested in anything other than the shortest, quickest, easiest route to goal in terms of managing knotweed or any other invasive weed, we have a legal imperative to consider all the alternatives and to do so in a very visible way. So just to bring you up to date now with some glyphosate news. First of all, the European Commission started a new approval concerning the registration of glyphosate starting approximately 5 years ago. So as soon as they extended the approvals for glyphosate for 5 years, they announced that there would need to be another review leading up to the anniversary of 5 years, and that's coming up pretty soon, 3 weeks' time. Eek! So in 3 weeks' time, we could have some bad news. But in reality, what's happened, not surprisingly because of COVID, everything's been delayed. They've had new data submissions that have come in that they want to consider and incorporate into their review. So the review is in progress. But actually the approval process is going to be extended now to July next year, so we won't have any kind of white smoke coming out of the chimney of the European Commission on glyphosate until at least July 2023. So this is the assessment group for glyphosate report is now due to come out at that time. So that's one deadline that we're looking at in the UK, because after December 2019, in January 2020, they extended the approvals for glyphosate in the UK for 5 years as we uncoupled from the European Union process. But I would expect that review will start fairly soon, so probably sometime next year, because they are long and complicated procedures. But what we're getting very consistent messages from regulators in general, European, American, worldwide, UK, about maintaining the status quo of glyphosate. And what we can tell you about this EU approval process, if I just click forward to this slide, is that they've already stated that there's going to be no change to the classification of glyphosate. So they've reviewed all the available evidence, all the toxicology, and they've said, despite work that was done 6 or 7 years ago in France, that there is no need to change the classification of glyphosate. And obviously when it's formulated, you need to take account of surfactants and so on, but on this basis alone, we would imagine that going forward there would still be clean label products for glyphosate. But what's happening now with the assessment group for glyphosate is that they're now looking at all of the food chain implications in terms of food products that are produced in agriculture and what that means in terms of human health and environmental impact and so on, rather than just the straight chemistry of glyphosate and its hazard classification. So finally on this slide, sustainable use. Well, when we actually look at sustainable use, and we're just comparing herbicides, so one herbicide with another, because that's part of the process, glyphosate consistently comes out as one of the best available options from a safety point of view, an environmental point of view, and from a cost-benefit point of view in terms of its performance. So adhering to the sustainable use regulations doesn't mean don't use glyphosate. It just means that we need to justify the use of glyphosate. And if I can just say something, because I think some of you already know that the exit door is open for me and I shall be walking through it fairly soon in the next few months, that when I first started in the industry, the control of pesticides regulations was the overarching control on pesticides and herbicides. And that always required a sustainable use argument to be made for the use of pesticides. So this isn't new in the UK. It might be new in Europe, but it's not new in the UK as far as our regulatory framework is concerned. We do need to justify the use of herbicides before we use them. So what can we do to counter some of the negative publicity? Well, as the PCA, we tend not to. get involved in these arguments because we don't feel like we're qualified to do so. But unfortunately, there are organisations which are countering some of the false reporting, if we can call it that, which appears in the media sometimes. And this is, I'm just drawing your attention to this organisation, the Genetic Literacy Project. And this is just in the last couple of, last 6 to 7 weeks or so. They frequently publish articles which are independent articles, mainly from academics, not from industry, not from vested interests, not from Monsanto or Bayer, but independent scientists who have reviewed the evidence that's being used by news outlets and just challenging the assumptions that are being made because they are very dangerous. And this isn't really about a commercial argument, it's just about making sure that we don't ban something just because of inappropriate interpretation of what is bad science. So this was an NBC article using, I think it was written by some very, very junior sort of office employee who wasn't even a journalist and just picking up on something on the internet that shouldn't really have been shared. This is a document, actually, a very, very detailed and lengthy document. I recommend you read it, you know, breaking down all of the claims about carcinogenicity. And this is just emphasising the fact that all these court cases in America are being challenged, and when they are challenged, a lot of them are failing. So now I want to talk about the future and the alternatives to glyphosate because you know, I think it's a really important tool in our armoury, but we need to think about how we go about justifying its continued use. And first thing to do under the sustainable use regulations, we need to think about a justification for controlling the target weed in the first place. So what level of control do we require? Are we going to manage it, control it, eradicate it? What is the imperative? I could do my own little ID course here, couldn't I? So yeah, hope everybody gets the picture. Japanese rose, in case you're wondering. And we need to consider always, you know, what the imperative is. Do we need to control it in the next 6 weeks, in the next 6 months, the next 6 years, or do we need to just stop it from spreading and not to remove it at all? And then we need to consider all non-chemical approaches. That's essentially what the sustainable use regulations are about. And there's been some research done on cutting or tarping, which is a term that they use in France. I mean, there's actually a very big slab of EU money that's going into a research project looking at tarping at a French research institute. And I think, as Dan and his colleagues has already said, yeah, we tried that, it doesn't work very well. And cutting could fall into the same category. We just starve the knotweed by constantly removing the shoots and the growing parts of the plant every year. And I think received wisdom is that this doesn't work very well either. But I've just read a report in Conservation Land Management magazine, I think it is, suggesting that if you do it for long enough, it can work, and the knotweed will stop growing. But of course, we don't really know for how long it will stop growing. So this study that I've just read went on for 11 years. 11 years of cutting on a nature reserve, I hasten to add. Okay, grazing. We've all seen the pictures of sheep grazing giant hogweed up in Scotland. That seems to be working quite well. Biological control. We're looking forward to hearing from Dick later on from Cabby about all the updates on whether we're going to get anything licensed for knotweed or Himalayan balsam in the near future. And of course, we can think about just competing with the knotweed through some cutting, some mechanical disturbance, and then revegetation. So we're going to have competing swards of other plants that are going to come in and suppress its ability to grow. And I'm looking forward to hearing Sophie's talk later on about revegetation strategies. Just carrying on with the alternatives. Oh, by the way, how many people have seen some of this year? It's not Japanese knotweed, it's Bohemian knotweed, so hybrid, nice big leaves, slightly curly outline, slightly indented at the base. It's knotweed, Jim, but not as we know it. So just be interested. I'm toying with the idea of doing a survey soon just to find out exactly how common hybrid knotweed is in this country. So non-herbicide approaches, we've got root wave electricides, as they call it. We've got hot foams, we've got various UV and so on, infrared radiation systems, and scarifying systems. Now, most of these can and are used to some extent or another. We'll hear from Alan, a lot more detail in a minute, for general weed control. And I know that, and I know that the electricides have been used on a number of sites for a number of years for Japanese knotweed, but not proving to be fully effective at suppressing regrowth yet. So perhaps that will be like cutting. You know, if you do it for long enough, if you do it for enough years, you can suppress it eventually. So, and then we can start looking at other herbicides. Well, we know there's not a huge number to choose from that would be effective against things like Japanese knotweed, but obviously the danger here is that they're foliar applied, but they're not systemic necessarily, so we don't get the kill back in the root system. There are other things on the market, mixtures of triclopyr and aminopyralid, which allegedly work very well on Japanese knotweed and can prevent regrowth for a few years, but they are highly restricted in terms of their scope of use. So if anybody's out there using triclopyr and aminopyralid as a mixture for residential knotweed control or in any kind of public setting, please stop doing it now. Other herbicides, again, we can look at the so-called natural herbicides like organic acids, acetic acid, pelargonic acid. But again, they're not systemic, they're contact herbicides, so they can have a good knockdown effect. Sorry, I don't want to focus too much on Japanese knotweed. Obviously, there are lots of other invasive weeds besides, so some of these may have more or less value and use in the context of invasive weed control. Sulfonyl ureas are potentially systemic herbicides which can have a residual effect, but most of the commercial products that I'm aware of don't claim control of more than a few months at a time. They can be used in pre-emergence and post-emergence, and certainly none of them are suitable for use against Japanese knotweed as far as I'm aware at the moment. And then again, getting back to the sustainable use, optimization, we can look at glyphosate dosing and frequency and application, how we're applying it. So thinking about how much we're applying. So the sustainable use regulations say if you're going to use a herbicide, that's fine, but then you need to maximize the performance of the herbicide you're using. So minimum dose for maximum impact. And recently, there's possibility of looking at using some synergies. I did work on a herbicide research project at Trent Polytechnic, now Nottingham Trent University, on antagonisms and synergisms amongst herbicides. They are a real thing, and I've seen a product recently which is a mixture of 2,4-D and glyphosate for horsetail control, which on the face of it appears to be claiming synergistic effects for that combination of herbicides on that target weed. So just to try and sum it all up, it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the situation with glyphosate, what we need to do to make sure we're applying the principles of sustainable use regulations. But where we are now is we're waiting for regulators to confirm the future scope and range of approved uses for glyphosate. We're currently in a situation where we're doing everything we possibly can as an organisation and as individual companies to make sure we're complying with the legal conditions of use currently in place. We don't want to give the regulators any reasons at all to change the rule book, as it were. And we need to make sure that we're applying the principles of sustainability in everything that we do. We will respond professionally to clients and other stakeholders who have concerns about glyphosate. We don't want to be glib about these things. We need to make sure that we're talking about environmental impact and human safety and all these issues, but from a very professional perspective. And as the PCA are concerned, we want to encourage and support new research into both existing and novel methods of management that might help us to reduce dependency on herbicides or just find better ways of using the herbicides that we have. I hope everybody's recognised the broadleaf bamboo over there. I don't think Max has got any in his ID test, so we'll get away with that one. So thank you very much for your attention. Sorry to start the day with some heavy-duty chemistry, but at least we've got it out of the way now. Hopefully going forward we can continue to do battle against these invasive weeds using a full suite of different things. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.